Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today on Point of View. It is the Tuesday edition, and certainly grateful that you can join us today. Going to spend some time talking about COVID and the pandemic. There are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, that's a lot of what's in the news today. The president, I don't think he's already spoken yet, but if he has, I've missed it, is going to address some issues which we'll be talking about in terms of some of these tests and a number of others. We'll get into some of the other issues in the news a little bit later. Inflation is one of the articles we've posted, and even just maybe some comments about this White House message on COVID and the decision to just about close down everything. I'm going to give you kind of a short list in just a minute for those of you that love professional or college sports, what has happened to the National Hockey League, the National Football League, what is happening right now with the National Basketball Association. And of course, don't forget, we have NCAA, that's everything from basketball to football. So we will get into all of that. And for those of you that like to take some notes, I might give you an advance warning. You might want to get something to write with, because I want to give you some numbers. I've been digging for a while here, and it just seems to me that I ought to at least give you the right numbers. At least that. Can we at least agree on the facts? Maybe not even there. For example, just a fun one right off the top of my head. I heard a program last night where somebody was talking about the fact that the Omicron variant is not that dangerous because no one has died of it yet. And I sort of said, well, is that true? Well, it turns out that yesterday, as far as we can determine, this is the first known recorded death from Omicron. It happened in Harris County. That's where Houston is. This was a man. Now, they don't give you all the facts, obviously, because we have HIPAA rules, but we know that this is an individual in his 50s or 60s, and he had other kinds of complications. So, given the fact that, and I'll give you some numbers in just a minute, the percentage of individual cases we think now come from Omicron, are we overreacting? And of course, we always hear, out of an abundance of caution, we will basically close down all sports, I've just been talking off air here about various programs that have been canceled, plays that have been canceled. Matter of fact, in the second hour, we're going to be talking about this wonderful book, God in the Modern Wing, and it's about viewing art through the eyes of faith. In other words, how do we as Christians look at that? And I think during the Christmas season, this is a great time to go to an art museum. It's a great time to go to a concert. It's a great time to enjoy some of the great art that has been produced. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of that art we have trouble making sense of, like what's called oftentimes modern art. But how do we think through that as well? That'll be our second hour. By the way, Steve Miller will be joining us, and we'll be talking with an individual that has actually put this together as an editor, Cameron Anderson, and some of the other authors. So we will talk about the arts, and it's something I want to do from time to time. But again, if we just close everything down, a lot of people are predicting that Christmas 2021 is going to look like Christmas 2020. And again, you can come to your own opinions. I'm just going to give you some of the facts, and some of them maybe make your case, some of them go against your case, but here they are. As best as we can determine, 496 million COVID vaccination shots have been administered so far. So that means a lot of people have been able to get 1, 2, or in some cases have boosters, 3 shots. Then you have, in round numbers, this is the best numbers we can come up with, 52 million Americans who have been infected with COVID and thus have some degree of natural immunity. Now, that varies from place to place and time to time and person to person. I mean, some studies have shown, for example, that natural immunity may actually last longer than that brought about by a vaccine. Is that universally true? No, it's not, because some people get very light infections. Sometimes they fight it off. They don't develop enough antibodies. So anytime you start coming up with some kind of rule, I can come up with some exceptions to challenge that as well. But let me, before I even go any further, just go to a piece that we posted, and I'll get to in just a few minutes. But Michael Brennan Doherty reminded us of the fact that he says, and I'm quoting from him right now, "For reasons that are mystifying to me, the White House refuses to note that they have presided over the fastest vaccine uptake in the history of this country and one of the most successful campaigns in the world. The vast majority of most vulnerable people have chosen to be immunized against COVID-19. And you may not know a lot about politics, but I bet you probably can figure this one out. When a politician has a success, he or she just talks about it constantly. You remember the previous president, Donald Trump? Anytime he had a success, did we hear about it? Oh, we heard about it a lot. We saw lots of tweets about it, everything. This president has had the most successful, if you will, vaccine uptake in the history of this country. Perhaps the most successful one in this country compared to any other country other than, I might say, Israel has maybe beaten us in terms of percentages, but that's about it. You would think that the president today, when he either has spoken or will spoke, I don't know what's been happening the last hour here because I've been working on other projects, would mention that. But instead, what is he focused on? This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated, which I think tells you something about, we're not really talking about safety here. We're really not talking about, let's pat ourselves on the back a little bit and suggest that maybe we've done the right thing. Let's just keep pushing for the few individuals out there that aren't vaccinated and then trying to push this kind of concern about fear and the rest. And of course, this is why I think some people have said, wait a minute. If you really want to be fair, then maybe we should apply to this president the criticisms this president as a candidate made about the previous president. For example, I'll give you this quote. In October of a year ago, candidate Joe Biden said that 220,000 deaths from COVID was a reason why the current president, that would be, of course, Donald Trump, should not remain as president of the United States. Well, if you haven't been keeping track of the numbers, right now you have just under the Biden presidency nearly 400,000 deaths. So we're closing in almost twice as many deaths under his administration as were recorded at that time in October. And so if indeed your argument is that any time somebody is the president and more than 200,000 people die, that's reason enough to remove that person from office. Well, you see, if you applied the same standard to President Joe Biden, then that would be the case. And maybe that gives you an answer to a question we raised the other day about why the mainstream press hasn't spent a lot of time talking about the number of deaths, but simply wants to talk about the cases, because it doesn't take much for people with a little bit of mathematical ability to say, wait a minute, if that's the standard that you use to justify why you should remove Donald Trump from office, it should be the standard for why we remove you from office. The bottom line, of course, is neither of those were fair criticism. I wouldn't use them, but I simply want to say that you're starting to see more and more people making a statement that if indeed some of the things said during the heat of the campaign a few months ago are the justification for removing somebody from office, well, then that's the case. They weren't good comments back then, not good comments now, but it is kind of interesting to look at. We come back from the break, though. Let me talk about a couple of things. The president's going to want to try to provide 500 million COVID-19 tests that could be provided, and yet we have some pretty good evidence to suggest that we're having trouble providing the tests that are available right now due to some, obviously, supply chain issues. So we'll talk about that. And for those of you who like to watch sports, well, we're going to have to put some of it on pause. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, during this Christmas week, I've taken the time to discuss the theology of some of the Christmas hymns and carols that we sing. Today, I'd like to talk about the First Noel. It is an English song dating back to the 16th century. Some people believe that the First Noel was French because of the French spelling of Noel, but it is actually an English song. The French word Noel does mean Christmas and is relevant to the lyrics of the song. The First Noel was published in 1833 when it appeared in the work Christmas Carols Ancient and Modern. The first line of the song suggests a December date for the birth of Christ. The first Noel, the angels did say, was to certain poor shepherds in the fields as they lay, in the fields where they lay keeping their sheep on a cold winter's night that was so deep. Although many doubt that Jesus was born in December, there are some theologians, such as the author of the chronological aspects of the life of Christ, who believe that a December date is possible. Whatever the case about the date of the birth of Jesus, the song continues, "Born is the King of Israel." It reminds us that a king was born that night, yet few understood the significance of a birth in Bethlehem. Even the wise men from the east did not completely understand the significance of his birth, but they were guided to him by a star. For all to see there was a star shining in the east beyond them far, and to the earth it gave great light, and so it continued both day and night. The song continues on to say that 3 wise men came from a country far. The Bible does not tell us how many wise men there were. What we do know, there were 3 kinds of gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. What the Bible clearly teaches, however, is that Jesus was born and that he is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
This afternoon, the president will announce to the nation the fact that he wants 500 million free rapid tests for Americans, and that is because of the Omicron variant that is scheduled this afternoon, and he's detailing major changes in the winter plan for COVID-19, and this is an announcement that, again, we would have those rapid tests. Well, again, Jim Garrity is very good at pulling together some of the things around the country because, as he points out, if you look at various places in this country right now in which you've tried to find a COVID-19 test at your local drugstore, for example, you've been out of luck. The Biden administration has been encouraging people to take COVID-19 tests, but they haven't done a real good job of maybe checking to see how many of those are available. Let's just pick a couple places around the country to illustrate the point. Philadelphia Department of Health is giving out free at-home test kits at 9 pop-up clinics around the city with the goal of handing out about 24,000 before Christmas. What you probably have seen if you watch television is the picture of hundreds of people standing in line outside of libraries and recreation centers to try to get those. Let's go to New York City because they are really hit right now with some of the issues with COVID. And again, one Brooklyn location already sold out its entire inventory of 2,000 kits in just 2 days. One pharmacy tests were going for $39 a piece. And then, of course, some of them were actually, I don't know if that's legal, doubling the cost, but you know how that gets going. We'll go to Washington, D.C. Finding a rapid at-home COVID-19 test has become nearly impossible in the District of Columbia or in Maryland or in Virginia. So those of you that are members of Congress or work for the government, you're sort of out of luck. We have listeners in Ohio, so let's pick this one from Columbus, Ohio for just a minute. Columbus Public Health announced that it won't be able to receive another shipment of free COVID-19 tests from the Ohio Department of Health until January. So the bottom line is you're looking, and I've got lists here. This is Connecticut. There's St. Louis. There's Pittsburgh. Oh, there's one in Dallas. I just have all sorts of places where if you're just looking for a COVID test, you're really out of luck. Or you're going to stand in line in the cold for some time hoping that that will be the case. Now, if you are one of those people, and I suspect this is probably in single digits as a percentage, but if you're one of those people listening to Point of View right now that tends to watch press conferences, you might remember that about 2 weeks ago, the White House spokesperson, that would be Jen Psaki, was asked by a reporter, should we just send one of these, if you will, COVID-19 tests to every American? And then we would allow everybody to be tested simultaneously. And she scoffed at that and all the rest, but that's sort of what's being done right now. Now, if you've done the math here, okay, 500 million. We don't have 500 million Americans, right? I think I've got my math right here. I'm kidding, of course. And you can kind of just get the sense of what is happening here in terms of some of the action. So even though the president's going to announce that, it's going to sound good. Hopefully somebody has been working to try to behind the scenes gear up the production of those, because if indeed he wants everybody to be able to have access to a test, right now, a lot of people are standing in line and a lot of people are going home without any of those COVID-19 tests. Let's just real briefly, and then I do want to move on to some other topics, especially in light of how the Supreme Court might address this issue, because there's a case before them right now, or a case going to them is probably a better way to say it. And that is for those of you that love sports. Again, we love Christmas, but we also love year-end. Some of us love to watch sports. Sometimes it's the first time we have a break. And I might even announce we're going to get a break on Friday, the day before Christmas. We will be playing a tape. That'd be the first time in a while where we've had that kind of break, and it's going to be one we'll enjoy. And usually, you like to watch some sports, but you'd be out of luck. Let's take the National Hockey Association. They announced yesterday that after 2 games today, it would pause the current season of the NHL until after Christmas Day. 4 of the Wednesday games have already been postponed, and so the games will not be resuming until December 27th. And can I put a question mark on that? Because we know how some of this has been moved rather dramatically. So that's hockey. Well, you love football. Well, again, the NFL already postponed 3 of the Week 15 games due to COVID-19. Saturday's scheduled game between the Cleveland Browns and Las Vegas Raiders, was rescheduled for Monday. And you had a couple of others, and of course you can watch what's going on there. You also, of course, have a lot of these protocols. You have the NFL and NBA protocols, some of which are now changing. And of course, when you look at some of these teams, for example, you had a game scheduled between the Seattle Seahawks and the Los Angeles Rams. As of last Friday, the Rams had placed 29 players on COVID-19 reserve list. The Washington football team, used to be called the Redskins, put 23 players on the COVID-19 reserve list. And it's probably good to mention that a lot of these individuals tend to be asymptomatic. But if you test positive, that's it. So let's go to NBA real quickly before I wear everybody out with all the sports announcements. But the NBA has postponed 5 games as well. And so that's going to affect those of you that wanted to watch, for example, the Brooklyn Nets or the Cleveland Cavaliers, Orlando Magic, the Philadelphia 76ers. And you've had some others along the way as well. Monday's game between the Magic and the Raptors was also postponed. And Tuesday's game with the Nets and the Wizards, I think, has been postponed as well. And then finally, have college. First of all, college basketball. You can imagine what's going on right now. You had games, for example, between number 2 Duke and Loyola, and between number 4 UCLA and North Carolina, which were scheduled for Saturday, which were canceled due to COVID-19. Not to mention, of course, you've got some of these football games and conference games taking place as well. And so when you start looking at all of those, it's just a long list of what is happening right now. And so if those of us that like to watch sports, well, we're on pause at the moment. Before we take a bottom of the hour break, let me just mention briefly, and I'll come back to it with a little more detail, the cases that are making their way through the courts probably will end up on the Supreme Court. And so even though we won't have our Friday weekend edition between now and maybe Thursday, I will try to give you more of an update on that, because what you have is a set of contradictory kinds of rulings from these appeals courts. And if you've listened to some of the conversation we've had here before with whether it's Jeremy Dice or Lathan Watts or certainly Kelly Shackelford, when there's a dissension, there's a difference between, say, the Fifth Circuit Court and the Sixth Circuit Court, which is what I'm going to talk about. That's going to almost force the Supreme Court to do something to sort of resolve that. And yet, as we've seen so far, the Supreme Court hasn't been real interested in doing that, because we've seen, as I mentioned just the other day, that you had Chief Justice John Roberts joined by two supposed conservatives, that would be Justices Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, who actually did not overturn the religious exemption for New York, but also didn't deal with Maine's health care worker vaccine mandate either. So a couple of issues that suggest that they would kind of like to avoid making a decision. But when we come back from the break, I'll go into this in a little more detail before we move on to some other topics. But you have the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's one that's out of New Orleans and pretty much relates to the Southwest. And they had actually extended what's called a stay, that is to prevent the implementation from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, known as OSHA, in requiring all employees that have employers that have more than 100 or more workers to be vaccinated or weekly tested. Well, that thought was going to be held for a while until the Sixth Circuit Court, in a 2-1, and basically that was changed by two justices. Can you believe that? Two judges are enough to completely change that ruling, because the way our court system works right now, two people can determine whether or not OSHA can do this. They said yes, even though there was a dissent. And again, I've always been a little bit amazed that we can have 5 Supreme Court justices redefine what marriage is. In this case, you can have 2 judges in the Sixth Circuit Court to say, oh, yeah, OSHA can do this. And I suspect the Supreme Court's going to have to rule. But we'll talk about that after the break. Let me just mention, though, as we go to a break, that we have been encouraging you to think about what you might want to do to support this ministry. I'm sure in just the last half an hour, you've probably heard a few things you've heard nowhere else, and if you value that, we have an opportunity for you as you go to our website to light a candle. We want you to be able to light a candle in your community, and we want to give you the resources to be able to be effective. So let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. There's a button there that says donate, and you can make a gift of whatever you might want to do. As we go to a break, you could also call somebody offline. You don't have to go on the air. This is our pledge line number, 800-347-5151. And most importantly, as we pointed out, we've put a match on the table, so it's a $1-for-$1 match. Your gift will be doubled, and that's something I would encourage you to consider doing right now. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk a bit more about some of these important issues right after this.
At Point of View, we are already thinking about our New Year's resolution to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. But we can't accomplish that without your support. And right now, your support is especially critical, because whatever you give now through December 31st will be doubled up to $85,000. That means all gifts, whether $10 or $1,000, doubled through December 31st. Did you know Point of View is 100% listener supported? And it's more than just a radio show. Thanks to your support, we offer free tools to help Americans build a Christian worldview in their own lives and live it out in practical ways. Don't miss this opportunity to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. Give by December 31st to have twice the impact. To give today, visit pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. And if you'd like to join the conversation, let's open up the phones. Perhaps you are thinking as you're hearing some of these facts and figures saying, maybe we're just overreacting, or maybe, again, to be prudent. This is the kind of thing that we need to do. But one of the articles we've posted here comes from Michael Brendan Doherty, in which I really appreciate the fact that he reminded us of something, and that is he's completely mystified why the White House doesn't maybe at least start off with some kind of positive and saying that we've had the fastest vaccine uptake in the history of this country, one of the most successful campaigns in the world, and instead it's on a downer because it reminds us that the other day the president said for the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter of severe illness and death for yourselves, your family, and hospitals will soon overwhelm. First of all, I'm not sure how accurate that is, but is that the way you kind of want to start out your conversation? Because as he says, this is dehumanizing language and overboard even by the administration's own terms. Many children are not eligible for vaccines. Many parents won't choose to get their children vaccinated anyway for obvious reasons. The danger posed by COVID to children is so remote and minuscule, and the benefit of reduced transmission among children is so diffuse and potentially tiny, these children won't have a winter of severe illness and death. And so that was his comment about this. We haven't said much about the statement that the president made in the past. Tomorrow we'll probably talk about what he will say today, and I fear it's going to be the same kind of message. At a Christmas time, maybe people need some hope, maybe need some encouragement, and that's certainly not what we're getting. Our good friend Gary Bauer even said, look, the variant is spreading rapidly, but it seems to only affect the nose and upper respiratory tract. Matter of fact, one of the other articles I've posted here is which Dr. Robert Malone, you might say, well, who's he? Well, he was one of the individuals that helped work on the vaccine originally. He said this could be a Christmas present because it seems that this one settles higher in the lungs, causes, as some people have said, the worst sometimes is, what's the list here? Stuffy nose, sore throat. Gary Bowers even pointed out that now we're up to more than 95% of the athletes in the NFL are vaccinated. So even when they're testing positive, some of them maybe have a stuffy nose. Some of them are almost asymptomatic, but because there's mandatory testing, we know they're actually positive in the first place. And so he's wondered whether we've overreacted, and I would love to get your thoughts about that. 1-800-351-1212. But just before we move on to some other topics, I think it's important to recognize that our third article here reminds us that this probably ends up in the Supreme Court. And I just can tell right now that none of the justices probably in the Supreme Court want to take this on. First of all, it's controversial. Second of all, not one of them is a virologist. Not one of them knows how to sort through all of these issues. But we're not asking them to sort through the medical issues. We're asking them to determine whether or not the Occupational Safety and Health Administration can all of a sudden issue these kinds of mandates. Well, the Fifth Circuit Court said, no, I don't think so. This has been a case in which you have not actually followed congressional procedure. But the Sixth Circuit Court said, no, we're going to move ahead. At least two justices said, look, we do give the Labor Secretary the opportunity, as well as people in OSHA, to look at whether there's some kind of toxic particular substance which would then expose people to grave danger. Now, the bottom line is when that law was written, they were thinking about toxic substances like, maybe asbestos, various kinds of very harmful chemicals and other things of that nature. Of course, even things like cyanide and the rest. And so the two judges in the Sixth Circuit Court said, well, that fits our definition of an agent. And so we're going to say that since they have the authority to protect people from some kind of toxin or some kind of physically potentially harmful agent, that gives these individuals at the OSHA an opportunity then to tell anybody who then actually is unvaccinated to actually be tested weekly and to require everybody to be vaccinated rather than even to be tested. Interesting enough, in the dissent, I thought it was kind of interesting because this came from Judge Larson, said, the government's own data reveal that the death rate for unvaccinated people between the ages of 18 and 29 is roughly equivalent to that of vaccinated persons between 50 and 64. But we will see where that goes. So a lot of people sort of wonder, is this something that actually is going to lead to further requirements or the rest? Because up until just the other day, every one of these vaccine mandates has been either struck down or actually been stayed, and now you have the first one going the other direction. I'm thinking before we're all through, though, what we're going to have to do is see what the Supreme Court might do. But as we will be talking about next hour, this is a time really, I think, where we can celebrate the arts. I think it would be great to go into an art museum and look at some of the beautiful paintings and sculptures. I think it would be wonderful to go to a concert. And Gary Bauer once again said, isn't this kind of ironic? Because he says, the musical Hamilton is playing on Broadway. Everyone on Broadway is vaccinated in order to perform in any show. The audiences are vaccinated. They have to show proof of vaccination to attend the shows. But Hamilton and other Broadway shows are being shut down until further notice. And, of course, then he points out, of course, you had the athletes, 95% vaccinated, essentially almost 100%, because even the others are very healthy. But he reminds us that over the weekend, you had two doctors, Anthony Fauci and outgoing Francis Collins, who is, by the way, the retiring head of the National Institute of Health, that probably did as much as possible to spread more concern and panic. Anthony Fauci, for example, suggested, as we talked about yesterday, that masks on airplanes will never go away. Francis Collins, once again, talked about the fact that he really wasn't concerned about where the virus came from because that's just, quote, a distraction. So here we go again. And he says these are people that are actually supposed to help us think through some of those issues. And he said one of the most important details being downplayed is, whether they realize it or not, the message from the health officials that they're sending is that the vaccines don't give you any more liberty than you had before. Perhaps new information will lead us to conclude something else about Omicron, but so far the political left and their media allies are raising what he says are irrational fears. So there's where you get all those comments. But just before we end and get into some other topics, I at least wanted to point you to one other piece, and it is our fourth article. It is an interview that had been done with Dr. Robert Malone. I might say, okay, who is he? Well, he is one of the individuals that actually helped with this. He was one of the inventors of the mRNA technology that is used by the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. So he knows a little bit about virology. And he has argued that if you look at the various pieces of evidence coming out right now, it appears from his assessment that Omicron is very different than the previous COVID-19, or SARS-CoV-2 is the actual title, which would settle in the deep lungs. These tend to settle in the upper respiratory tract, and so are maybe more transmissible but less virulent. And so on the one hand, he says, we see a lot of evidence that suggests it is much less dangerous, as evidenced by the fact that so far we've now had one death that we know of from Omicron, and that one happened in Harris County here in Texas. But he's also honest enough to say, look, if you look at a study that's come out of the Imperial College of London, they say, at least in the UK, they don't see much difference between hospitalizations for Omicron and Delta. I might also point out that that study was done by Neil Ferguson. You might remember that name. That's the guy that actually told us that we were going to have 2.2 million U.S. deaths, and one of the people that actually argued for a complete shutdown of the economy. And so he's really spent some time looking at this. And to be fair, said, we do have one study that hasn't been published yet, but it's a preprint saying, well, we don't see much difference. But even the researchers admitted that the initial report on hospitalization is very limited at this time because, after all, you only have a small number of cases that you can do. So I would say that still the evidence that came from South Africa, the evidence that's coming out from some of these other studies, suggests that Omicron is nothing like the Delta variant. And as a result, we don't necessarily have to assume that Christmas 2021 is going to be just like Christmas 2020. But you never know. So those are some facts we put on the table. When we come back, I want to talk briefly about the other issue that Americans are as equally, perhaps even more concerned about, and that's inflation. And that's the first article we have on our website. And the next hour, we're going to talk about theology, art, and cultural engagement. And just get out of this, talk about the arts, talk about maybe some things we should do to feed our minds and our soul. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Next hour, we're going to spend some time talking about theology, art, and cultural engagement. And just as a program note, let me just mention that tomorrow we will have in studio with us the Attorney General of the state of Texas, and that is Ken Paxton. He has filed a number of lawsuits against this administration on a variety of different topics, including some of these that we've discussed today related to COVID. He also has been the recipient of a lawsuit that was filed by the U.S. Attorney General against him in terms of the way in which the state of Texas has actually dealt with these various congressional districts, which is oftentimes called gerrymandering. And of course, we recognize that there is gerrymandering that takes place both in blue states and in red states. So we may not like it, but the reality is the case. And so there's always these lawsuits. And so I'll get his comments about that as well. Election integrity and a variety of other topics. So he will be in studio with us in the first hour tomorrow. Second hour, we're going to have our good friend John Stonestreet with us with Breakpoint commentary and talking about the importance of worldview. We'll also have Jim Dennison with us of the Daily Article, and he'll talk about how we think about some of these things from a Christian point of view. So there won't be as much opportunity to talk about issues in the news, so we'll pick up some of that probably on Thursday. One of the articles I think I may post for tomorrow, I thought about mentioning it today, comes from Kira Davis. She's African-American, a commentator. We told you so. And she starts out by talking about the fact she was kind of a never-Trumper, and then later on began to change her mind a little bit. And then when her husband said, I don't care who you vote for, I'm voting for Trump because I really don't like Hillary Clinton, she sort of says, okay, maybe I made some mistakes. Maybe I did judge things too quickly. And then uses that to say the same sort of thing happened with COVID. You know, at first it's like, yeah, we need to do with this. And then she started looking at some of the facts and figures and saying, wait a minute, you know, a virus is going to do what a virus is going to do, and we maybe just need to think more clearly about this. And then quotes from a number of CNN anchors, Brian Stelter, Chris Cillizza, and others that are starting to say, you know, maybe we were wrong about this whole idea of COVID-19 and lockdowns and all the rest. And so, anyway, it's a really good piece because looking at it from a little different perspective, and as a person that at one point sort of accepted the public assessment and then dug in a little bit more and changed your mind. It's a good piece, so I'll post it tomorrow. We won't have a chance to talk about it, but you might want to read it, as well as a few other articles I'll post, which also relate to some of the conversation we're going to have with Ken Paxton, John Stonestreet, and Jim Dennison. But just before we wind down today, let me go to my first article. It's Selena Zito, and she takes us to Pennsylvania, a place called Brownsville. And she says, you know, just before 10 a.m., cars begin pulling into the parking lot here at the Thrift Market, and it's a grocery store. And it's about 40 miles from Pittsburgh, if you kind of know where this is. She says, normally folks in this area shop for gently used clothing, toys, and deeply discounted home goods. But today is different because Santa is on site along with free cookies, provisions, frozen turkeys, hundreds of brand new winter coats in every size. And the point she's making is these are the people that oftentimes call the working poor. It is a difficult set of circumstances where working Americans are really trying, and sometimes when I hear somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or others say hardworking Americans, do you even hang with these people? Because I do, and you have, most likely. Individuals that are just trying to afford just really the basic needs at a time when we have inflation. What is it? A 6.8% surge in consumer costs. So if you felt a little bit of a struggle trying to make ends meet right now as a listener to Point of View, imagine if you really find yourself in a middle income or lower income household where your salaries aren't keeping up with inflation. And this is why I sometimes get outraged. I try not to get too angry on air when people say inflation is good for you. It doesn't hurt the poor. What world do you live in when a disproportionate amount of the income that you bring in, and you work more than one job, goes to food and energy? Those are the primary functions. You know, you have to put gas in your car. You have to keep your house warm in some way or another. You have to feed your family. And for individuals that are wealthy, that's a smaller percentage. So if those numbers go up, it doesn't affect you half as much as it does there. And so, again, she talks about the fact that while the media usually focuses on folks quitting their jobs in the Great Resignation, the people at this event often work more than one job only to be crushed by rising costs. She says, say you're a working mom and dad and both are paid $9.50 an hour. If both of them get a 50-cent an hour raise, they not only lose their ability to get assistance for food, that family is now not eligible for rental assistance, utility assistance, child care assistance. So on that very small increase in income, they have found themselves in a real economic dilemma. And she points out these situations are a vast majority of the families that we serve, working families who are facing both a loss of assistance as well as the impact of rising cost. And again, it just reminds us of the fact the price of gas has gone up 58 percentage points, utilities 25%, bacon 21%, chicken 9%, eggs, coffee, apples, flour, milk up 6 to 8%. You can get the idea. Want to buy a bike for your children for Christmas? Well, that's up 19 percentage points. And you can begin to see that this is something that is hurting anyone, but it's really hurting the working families of America. And it's about time for some of us as we get into this year of 2022. You're going to have people asking for your vote during the primaries, which are going to come pretty fast. And I think you need to find out what they plan to do about this issue of inflation, or whether they really do believe that money grows on trees, or money can be produced and printed by the Federal Reserve with no consequences whatsoever. So again, I hope that you will think about ways in which you can light a candle in your neighborhood. Just the other day, I rattled off a fairly short list of the top 20 cities, our towns, which have the greatest need. And as I was reading through that, some of you might have said, wait a minute, we actually have broadcast in those places, whether it's Fresno, California, Birmingham, Alabama, Augusta, Georgia, Detroit, Michigan. You start going through this list, and so I'm hoping that you will consider being generous in your community. And I hope that you'll reach out to maybe a needy family in your community, maybe a needy family in your church. I hope you'll support your church. I hope you'll support the radio station that carries this program. But I also did want to mention that we are encouraging you to think about, if you've never supported this ministry before, maybe send in just a one-time gift. You can go to the website, which says pointofview.net, light a candle. Hit that button that says donate, and you can put it on your credit card. Of course, you can also use the address and send it in that we make available. Or if you'd like to talk to someone off air, that pledge line number is 800-347-5151, because I know that you are probably a generous group. And next week, you will be reading a commentary in which I have quoted from an individual that we've had on this program before, because Arthur Brooks, when he was at Syracuse University, later he was at the American Enterprise Institute, but when he was at Syracuse, he wrote this book called Who Really Cares, and found that, as you might imagine, conservatives give more than liberals, Christians give more than secularists, and it is, I think, a true statement that if you look at the amount of generosity from Americans, the generosity from this country alone, just the dollar figure, is more than the entire GDP of Israel and Denmark, and probably would have to add another country in there now, since those numbers were generated a couple of years ago. So the bottom line is, I know you're a generous group, and I hope that you will consider being generous for people in your community, in your church, and maybe even as you listen to Point of View, you might join with us as well. We have that information on our website at pointofview.net, but we're going to take a break, and really take a break from some of this news to focus some time and attention on how do we evaluate art from a Christian point of view. I think you're going to enjoy the conversation, and I look forward to bringing that to you right after these important messages.
At Point of View, we are already thinking about our New Year's resolution to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. But we can't accomplish that without your support. And right now, your support is especially critical, because whatever you give now through December 31st will be doubled up to $85,000. That means all gifts, whether $10 or $1,000, doubled through December 31st. Did you know Point of View is 100% listener supported? And it's more than just a radio show. Thanks to your support, we offer free tools to help Americans build a Christian worldview in their own lives and live it out in practical ways. Don't miss this opportunity to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. Give by December 31st to have twice the impact. To give today, visit pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about art and theology and cultural engagement. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, we really do believe that we as Christians need to understand how to evaluate the arts. This booklet that book that we put together, Arts, Media, and Culture, a Biblical Point of View, is something we've made available in the past, in which we look at the Christian in art, the Christian in film, the Christian in media, and much, much more. It's certainly an important issue. Even this time tomorrow, we have John Stonestreet with us, who is the commentator for Breakpoint, and we will be talking about the importance of Christians to have an influence in culture. So I think you would really enjoy the conversation we're going to have this hour as we talk about this book, God in the Modern World, Viewing Art with Eyes of Faith. Came out a couple of months ago, and the editor is Dr. Kerby Anderson. And before I bring him on the particular conversation, well, I knew that I was out of my depth and had to bring in a very gifted individual in the arts, and that is, of course, our producer, Steve Miller. So, Steve, first of all, it's always great to have you on either side of the glass, but it's great to have you on this side, especially when we talk about the arts.
Well, I appreciate it. It's great to be here. I hope you're not giving me too much credit here.
Well, certainly you know more about it even than I, and that is certainly going to be helpful as we talk with Kerby Anderson. Has, of course, a master's degree from the Academy of Art. He's an artist, associate director of Upper House, and a former executive director of Christians in the Visual Arts. He has served in the past on the staff of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. You may, if you're familiar with some of his other books, have seen his book, The Faithful Artist, A Vision for Evangelicalism and the Arts. He was also co-author of The Faith and Vision, 25 Years of Christians in the Visual Arts, and this new book, God in the Modern Wing. So, Kerby Anderson, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. My pleasure to be with you.
I'm going to let Steve ask a lot of questions, but I thought I'd start with one of the basics because, as I understand it, this book really came out of a series of talks which were given at Fourth Presbyterian Church, kind of over the course of about 3 years or so. Could you kind of help us understand how this all came about?
I will. And the idea for the book really was my co-editor, Dr. Walter Hansen. And Walter and his wife, Darlene, Walter's a biblical theologian. He and his wife, Darlene, would worship regularly at Fourth Pres on Sunday morning and sing the hymns and hear the prayers and the sermons, perhaps participate in communion, the kinds of things we do on Sunday morning, and often feel like they were meeting God there, which is, of course, why we go to worship on Sunday. But it was their practice often. The church was located right on Michigan Avenue, and they would walk Michigan Avenue about a mile south and have lunch at the Art Institute of Chicago, and then spend considerable time in the modern wing of the Art Institute in the afternoon. And Walter felt increasingly, as they were spending time there, that he was also, in some ways, hearing things from God, having an encounter with God, spiritual reality, not at all the same as the experience he was having in a more orthodox, biblically based kind of worship experience on Sunday morning, but feeling the power and the significance of the work that he was looking at and its spiritual meaning for his life. So one thing led to the next, and he asked the church if they could devote their adult education hour in November of 2015, all the Sundays in November, to a series of lectures about important artists and works of art in the modern wing, and that's when he and I began to collaborate. We did that for 2015, 2016, 2017, and then eventually this book came out of it, the book that we co-edited. So that's the thumbnail.
Cameron, this is Steve. Thanks again, for joining us. And one of the things in the introduction that you mentioned that I was particularly attracted to, you said that one of the things that the modernists had in common was this desire to respond to the spirit of the age. The revolutions, the wars of the 20th century, arguably the bloodiest century in history, left many people wondering why they should even create art. And why is it important for us to recognize modern art as a response to the spirit of the age?
Well, in one sense, if any of us and our listeners go to a museum of any sort, so classical, Renaissance, Baroque, we're always looking at art that is responding to the age and to the time. But yeah, I think that to understand modern art and what is clearly in some cases a lot of darkness, a lot of really kind of nihilism that we sometimes see when we first encounter it, is to understand that it really, much of it was made by artists actually painting in Europe at the time, and then artists who moved to the U.S. because of World War I and World War II, centered in New York and other places, but were responding to the real violence of World War I, World War II. There's a theme. There's a German philosopher, Theodor Adorno, and one of the questions that he asked is how, after all that kind of violence, can one ever even make art again? How can you ever write poetry or compose music or make a painting? Do anything that attempts to capture beauty after encountering that kind of violence. So that's not the only thing that modern art is about. It's also about a kind of desire for creative, a creative individual expression that is really not bound to any kind of history or creeds or confessions. So there's that kind of independence that artists are looking for as well, and often at the expense of tradition of any sort. So there's a rebellious spirit there as well, but it's important to capture the complexity of the moment, I think.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we want to get into a little bit more of the details and even talk about building a bridge. But this is a book which has about 10 chapters. I think Steve and I are going to look at maybe 5 of the 10, and about 190 pages, published by InterVarsity. And if you find yourself saying, I'm an artist, or I know somebody who's an artist that might benefit from that, or maybe you've gone to a museum and you said, I can't relate to this modern art stuff. Oh, how do I even think about this? This would be a very helpful book, and we have information about it on the website. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but knowing that sometimes, especially since it's been out a couple of months, it might be harder to find. We have a link so that you can either get it in paperback or Kindle, and it is really part of a series of studies as well that you might be interested in, but we wanted to focus on that today because if there's one type of art that a lot of people say, I have no idea what that's all about. I think we've already given you an understanding of why sometimes modern art is so dark. We will come back and try to give you some more perspective on that. And especially during this Christmas season, I'm suggesting that you need to do some stuff to get away from the news that we talk about every day. So go to an art museum, go to a concert, do something fun. We're going to take a break, and we will continue our conversation with Cameron Anderson as well as Steve Miller right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, during this Christmas week, I've taken the time to discuss the theology of some of the Christmas hymns and carols that we sing. Today, I'd like to talk about the First Noel. It is an English song dating back to the 16th century. Some people believe that the First Noel was French because of the French spelling of Noel, but it is actually an English song. The French word Noel does mean Christmas and is relevant to the lyrics of the song. The First Noel was published in 1833 when it appeared in the work Christmas Carols Ancient and Modern. The first line of the song suggests a December date for the birth of Christ. The first Noel, the angels did say, was to certain poor shepherds in the fields as they lay, in the fields where they lay keeping their sheep on a cold winter's night that was so deep. Although many doubt that Jesus was born in December, there are some theologians, such as the author of the chronological aspects of the life of Christ, who believe that a December date is possible. Whatever the case about the date of the birth of Jesus, the song continues, "Born is the King of Israel." It reminds us that a king was born that night, yet few understood the significance of a birth in Bethlehem. Even the wise men from the east did not completely understand the significance of his birth, but they were guided to him by a star. For all to see there was a star shining in the east beyond them far, and to the earth it gave great light, and so it continued both day and night. The song continues on to say that 3 wise men came from a country far. The Bible does not tell us how many wise men there were. What we do know, there were 3 kinds of gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. What the Bible clearly teaches, however, is that Jesus was born and that he is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Cameron Anderson. As again, we are talking about the book God in the Modern Wing, Viewing Art with the Eyes of Faith. We're talking about art, theology, and cultural engagement. Steve Miller with us as well. And Steve, just as we were coming to a break, I talked about this idea of a bridge, and that's a metaphor that shows up in the book, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And Cameron, the name of the bridge, could you pronounce that for me, the bridge there connecting the church? I want to say DuSable, but that doesn't seem right.
DuSable, probably, but yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. The DuSable Bridge connects the Fourth Presbyterian Church to the Art Institute of Chicago, where the Modern Wing is. And in a way, you mentioned that is kind of a metaphor for us providing a sort of bridge between faith and art. And in that way, we're able to enter into the world of others. We're able to avoid some of the cliched answers that we sometimes tend to give. Right, I remember, personally going through a sort of dark night of the soul, and one of the things that I concluded was that there were so many Christians around me that had all the answers, but it was because they were the only one posing the questions. And and I feel like when we give ear to the art, whether it's Kandinsky or Monet or Van Gogh or any of these variety of modern artists, we're able to listen to the questions they might have. How can that help us as Christians relating to the art world and those who are drawn to the arts?
Well, it's a very large question, right? Yeah, but yeah. I think that one of the besetting challenges that we face in the Christian community is culture mostly seems to pose a problem for us. And we sometimes imagine that we can actually live outside of culture, but mostly we live inside of it all the time, right? We share language, we use the same banks, maybe we go to some of the same schools, we're involved in the same businesses, cheer for the same sports teams, that sort of thing. So what artists do, and lots of others do this too, but one of the things that artists do is to help us slow down and to take a look at the world through their eyes as they see it. And I think modern art is interesting in this regard because one of the things that I think artists do modern artists spend a lot of time helping us think about is what does it actually mean to be human? What is the human experience of living in the world? Sometimes, it draws attention directly to the suffering of being human in the world, the darkness of the world. But often it points to transcendent things and to moments of great beauty and great pleasure. And so I think that's one of the opportunities that we have, looking at the visual arts, but listening to music and to just being in the culture generally. And then it really attunes us to what our neighbors are thinking about, how they're feeling, and how the world looks to them. And after all, Jesus himself commands us to love our neighbor, right? So this is helping us understand who our neighbors are.
Yeah. I always think of Acts 17 with Paul preaching at the Areopagus and
right.
Noting, and he says, the first thing he says to them, I spent time hanging out in your city, so to speak, and I realized
right.
you're a very religious people. So he understood the spirit of the age and was able to respond to it. I would like to jump right into one of the specific chapters. The very first chapter by Tim Lowley, this is actually a footnote. I may be chasing a rabbit here, but I was fascinated by just the little discussion he had of Warner Sallman's famous 1940 painting of the head of Christ. And if
right.
you grew up in a small church, or maybe not even that small, which I did, that's the picture you see. And it's a beautiful picture, but at some level, it fails to take into account the Messiah's Jewish heritage. He's kind of a white Messiah,
yeah, that's right.
And Lowley talks about this reappraisal of concepts that we have. And my question to you is just, how has modern art caused us to reframe some of our concepts of religious ideas, and how can that be helpful?
Yeah. Well, the painting that you're mentioning by Warner Sallman is a famous painting. It's probably been produced millions of times, actually. And I'm thinking that most of our listeners here, even if this picture isn't one that they couldn't assign this artist or title to the painting, they know this Head of Christ by Warner Sallman. And in fact, probably if some of us close our eyes to pray, or, we're studying one of the Gospels or something, and we, in our mind's eye, have some picture of Jesus, it might be this painting, right? It's just that ubiquitous. But I think, it is an interesting footnote, because one of the things that Sallman, he created this picture of Christ out of a picture of Christ he had in his own mind's eye and study of other art images. But it's possible to think that way and kind of be culturally misaligned, right? So he missed the Jewishness of Jesus. That would be the criticism, of his painting. Which reminds us, that we need to have a posture of openness to learn in the world. That doesn't mean that everything that we learn is true or good, right, or beautiful, but I think we have this experience often. I'm in a Bible study with two other friends right now via a Zoom call, and we're studying the Gospel of John. I wonder how many times I've studied the Gospel, and yet this time again we're seeing brand new things there that I've never noticed, right? So we want to be open in terms, and I think modern art is helping us to do that at its best, at least, to be open and to learn.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think it's Mako Fujimura mentions in his in his article is just, or maybe it's Bruce Herman, but it talks about the value of sitting down in front of a piece of art and taking the time not to use our own preconceptions as the filter of what this thing means. And I think maybe we can translate that over, as you've said, as you're looking into the Gospel of John. I didn't take time. Maybe I've never taken enough time looking at it. And when we think about art, we don't necessarily think about that connection with the gospel and considering it afresh and anew.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's I don't want to mix categories here, so I want to be careful about what I'm going to say. But I think that the arts and being in an art museum, and it's always a place of quiet, kind of hushed silence, almost reverence, right? Sometimes the museum can feel more sacred than the place I worshiped in on a Sunday morning, actually. It's an odd experience. But the spiritual disciplines generally invite us to be quiet and to slow down and to listen and to be careful. And I don't want to say, and I'm not saying that, looking at a painting is the same as, say, studying the Bible. But I also want to say there's something similar there, isn't there, about slowing down from the rush of life and asking especially important existential questions. Why am I here? Who am I? What's my purpose? What's the point? And that's the experience many people are having when they look at modern art in a museum. They're asking big human questions.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation. God in the Modern Wing. We're going to get into maybe transcendence and immanence, and get into a couple of other aspects of some of these different aspects of art. And again, if you would like to join us, feel free to do so, 1-800-351-1212. But most importantly, I think most of you are going to want to sit back and listen. If you get a copy of the book, let me just mention about 190 pages, but also much of the middle are some very beautiful pictures and diagrams and other things that would benefit from you, so that it isn't just hypothetical, but you can actually look at those paintings and sculptures as well. Just before we take a break, as we've talked about before, it's important for us to light a candle, and I hope we can light a candle even in the art community and recognize how important it is for us to think biblically about these issues. And so that's why we're doing this program today. And if you benefit from some of the things we provide here at Point of View, we do have an opportunity for you to donate to this ministry between now and the end of the year. Let me just mention, though, that we do have a match on the table, and I suspect it may run out before the end of the year. So if you're one of those people that like to wait to the end, you might want to consider the fact that we have a dollar-for-dollar match on the table right now. And I encourage you to support maybe the local arts, support your local church, support the radio station that carries this program, but I hope you also might consider supporting Point of View. Talking today about God in the Modern Wing, and we'll continue our conversation on this very important topic about art, theology, and culture right after this.
At Point of View, we're already thinking about our New Year's resolution to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. But we can't accomplish that without your support. And right now, your support is especially critical, because whatever you give now through December 31st will be doubled up to $85,000. That means all gifts, whether $10 or $1,000, doubled through December 31st. Did you know Point of View is 100% listener supported? And it's more than just a radio show. Thanks to your support, we offer free tools to help Americans build a Christian worldview in their own lives and live it out in practical ways. Don't miss this opportunity to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. Give by December 31st to have twice the impact. To give today, visit pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, and we are talking about the book God in the Modern Wing, Viewing Art with the Eyes of Faith, edited by Kerby Anderson, who is with us by phone. Steve Miller in studio. And Steve, I was just thinking, we've been talking about some of the chapters that Cameron has edited. Maybe it'd be fair to go to chapter 3, which he actually has written. So what about that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, and the chapter is, I think we mentioned it earlier in passing, but transcendence and immanence are a couple of the things that come up in your chapter. You say that we humans are perplexed by the nature of our nature, and you go on and
Good
talk
line.
about the craft of any sort. It makes an implicit reference to a creator, to, quote, skilled hands and conscious minds. And then you talk about the sculpture of Brancusi and Giacometti, and Giacometti's Walking Man, which probably people would recognize it. Maybe not so much as Warner Solomon's Jesus, but they would recognize it if they saw it. Let's talk, maybe first of all, just give a brief pass at transcendence and immanence and what they are and how that relates to these artists.
Yeah, well, it was my pleasure to write the introduction to the book and then the afterword, and then this was a chapter that I wrote based on these arguably two of the most important modernist sculptors, and Constantine Brancusi and Alberto Giacometti. And it was really enjoyable to sort of juxtapose the two of them, because Giacometti's work is figurative, and he builds figures up using plaster, and they're almost skeleton-like in their look. They have heavy bases, and so once these pieces are produced in plaster, they're often cast in bronze, sometimes in multiples. And many people have commented on Giacometti's work that his work really depicts what it is to live in the universe kind of alone, that his work is a picture of alienation. And I think that's right. But we became pretty caught up in some of these sculptures of his, especially Walking Man too, because we also noticed that Giacometti's figures are grounded, that they have the feet on the ground. So that's the immanence, right? Existing in the world. And they're kind of leaning forward, and they're going someplace. So are they just wandering, or are they headed someplace with purpose? But it just struck us that this is really the human situation of having our feet on the ground and trying to find our place in the world. So kind of quickly then, I compared that to the work of Brancusi, and the picture in the book is of a sculpture of his golden bird, and often polished bronze, bird-like figures pointing to the heavens and looking above, pointing to the sky, right? Pointing to our hope. And it seems to me that these two things together are the two dominant features of our being human, our being set in the world, but also that desire we have for transcendence, that longing that we have for something more. And in the lecture, at least that I gave about this, I was drawn immediately to the figure of Christ, right? God incarnate, who is fully human and fully divine, who knows our suffering, but he also knew his Father. So he drank the cup of suffering, but then the Father exalted him Lord of all. I'm not saying for a moment that is the actual subject of Brancusi's work or Giacometti's, that they're pointing to the Christ figure, but in another way they absolutely do. Because God-man, God taking on human form, and right at this time of year. The interesting thing I learned about these artists is they had deep Christian backgrounds as children. Actually, Giacometti attended a Reformed seminary during his high school years, and Brancusi was raised in a Romanian Orthodox church they grew up knowing the faith. They didn't stick with it in adult life, so far as we know, but certainly how they were raised and their thinking about the world was informed by a Christian worldview as children, at least.
And these are things that, just to harken back to what we mentioned before, that you don't come up with by just glancing at something.
Right.
You've got to give that some thought. And in some ways, maybe it's the Imago Dei in these two artists coming out in ways that they're not even necessarily aware of and that we can take advantage of and see as image bearers, you know.
I think that's right. I mean, these things are really wrapped up with each other. And again, earlier we were talking about, why spend this kind of time with art? Well, I mean, in my own case here I was drawn to these two artists and drawn to think about them. And then it did make me think about the incarnation, about, God entering the world in human form and firmly grounded in the world, and yet always pointing to the Father, right? And this does seem to be, these two features seem to be core to our human being, it seems to me. Yeah. We taste of suffering, but we long for something transcendent. I don't know of anyone who would deny that, actually.
Sure.
And they may not be people of faith at all. It could be the most secular person, but it seems to me these are core features.
You mentioned Picasso. You just mentioned the idea of longing. And in Picasso, you state that he had a pursuit of created beings characterized by incompletion and longing. So if you know Picasso, those out there listening, we were just talking over the break about some of the the disjointedness of some of the paintings of for instance Picasso, which of course in and of itself was a reaction to the disjointed spirit of the age. What do you think is important to recognize about specifically the spirituality of Picasso, or choose someone else perhaps? But I mean, as you said, Giacometti and Brancusi both had spiritual backgrounds.
Yeah, a number of these artists actually did. I know less about Picasso, but it is interesting that when he moves into Cubism, and pictures will probably come to mind, but these faces with all these geometric planes are sort of chopped up and difficult to look at, maybe looking kind of anguished. But what Picasso is trying to capture there is, well, how do you represent a person in a painting? We are, after all, so multifaceted, right? There's so many aspects to our being. And so this idea of Cubism was a way to look at, in this case, some faces or human forms in multiple ways. And we may not find the work edifying, or we may, right? But at least it communicates a kind of psychological complexity. I think another artist that is really interesting in this regard is the Jewish painter Mark Rothko, that Makoto Fujimura writes about, that his chapter is substantially about. And Rothko said at one point, he said this, I'm paraphrasing the quote here, but he said, and the Rothko paintings are very abstract, color-field paintings, just vivid, dark colors, kind of feather-edged rectangles on top of each other, so no recognizable kind of image, abstract entirely. But he says this, and Fujimura is encouraging us to sit with these paintings for a while. And so to paraphrase Rothko, Rothko said, if you find yourself standing in front of one of these paintings or looking at some of these paintings and find yourself having some kind of encounter with God, and it leads you to weep. If you find yourself weeping in front of my paintings, then you're having the same experience that I had when I painted them. Imagine that, right?
Yes. I talked about painting the abyss, if I remember right. So
that's right, yeah.
We need to take a break, but when we come back, I've got to at least ask one question. Marc Chagall, he's Jewish, and he's got a crucifixion in the painting. And so I want to get some comments from Cameron about that as well. This is all part of the book, God in the Modern Wing, Viewing Art with the Eyes of Faith. He is, of course, the editor along with Walter Hansen. It is published by InterVarsity. We have information about it on the website there. Got Wies van der Rohe as well as many of these sculptures by Salvador Dali, paintings by Picasso. Of course, we've mentioned a couple of others, Brancusi and all the rest, Jackson Pollock, all of it's in here. So again, I think it would be a book that would really engage some of your friends that are artists. Maybe you are an artist and would benefit from this. Might make some sense the next time you walk into the modern wing of an art gallery, and maybe can make some sense out of some of that from a Christian point of view. We'll continue our conversation with Steve Miller and with Cameron Anderson right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about the book God in the Modern Wing. And again, it is edited by Cameron Anderson, Walter Hansen. Cameron Anderson with us, and Steve Miller in studio. And we did mention Marc Chagall. That might be somewhere to go next. What do you think?
Yeah, we had mentioned this in passing before we left, but Marc Chagall, as a Jewish artist, we find the crucifixion as an element in his art. Can you speak to that and why that is well, it's interesting, but why?
Yeah. Well, Marc Chagall, Jewish man, and his paintings, work of his lifetime, very narrative, almost always dealing with biblical material, biblical stories. And certainly you would be expecting him to depict stories from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Testament, which he does, but he turned later in life to painting many pictures related to the Gospels, and his painting, White Crucifixion, one of the most important pieces of work in the Art Institute of Chicago in their Modern Wing collection, and one of the largest paintings Chagall ever did. And what he was trying to capture, he was in the U.S. at the time, if I understand it, and he was hearing reports of the suffering of European Jews in the 30s and the horrific things that were happening to them and their persecution. And he was trying to understand a way that he could paint about this, respond to it. And the only image he could imagine that would sufficiently describe their suffering was the picture of Christ on the cross. Mm. And so then the iconography in this painting is very Jewish. So some of the iconography we might normally see with a crucifixion painting that would be more kind of Christian in orientation, in this case is more Jewish in orientation. But he really is in this painting around the edges telling all kinds of stories about the suffering of these people. And he is describing the Nazis as the ones who are tormenting Christ. It's a powerful, powerful painting, and he never then tired of painting pictures of Jesus and stories of the Gospels again and again, hundreds and hundreds of times. It was his life's work.
And you and I...
So he was drawn to the story.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, he was just drawn to the story. He simply could not get the story of Jesus out of his mind. Mm-hmm. As a Jewish man. Mm-hmm.
Well, and you and I have gone back and forth, I think, a couple of times on email. One of our favorite authors is Chaim Potok, and he wrote My Name is Asher Lev and the Gift of Asher Lev, and it's a similar story, finding the crucifixion as the best means of the best depiction of suffering, which I think is kind of hard to wrap our heads around, when we think about it. A Jewish artist finding that suffering in there, but there's the universality of that suffering in that.
That's right. Yeah, there really is, and it. When we think about how to talk about our faith with friends and neighbors and people in the world, I mean, here's a place to have a conversation, isn't there? We all know something about suffering. If we don't, we will, right? Mm-hmm. We will all come to the end of our lives. We know other people who have gone on before us. We know people who suffer every day. And so isn't it interesting that, imagine being in a museum and I was standing before this very painting less than a month ago with a group of people from Fourth Presbyterian Church, because we did a book launch there. I went and looked at this painting again, and there you are. You're standing in front of the suffering Christ. It's hard not to feel the sense of his oneness with us in our own questioning and suffering. Yeah. So a central painting, one of the most important paintings that Chagall ever did.
Yeah. One more artist I want to take a look at. We have briefly talked about Mark Rothko, and you explained some of his styles, and it's not one of those things that you can just take a cursory look at. You have to spend time with it. You can't be a casual observer. One of the things that Makoto Fujimura mentions in his chapter is that Rothko painted the abyss. And Kerby mentioned that earlier. And he invites us to stand there. But what that did for Mako, anyway, was to give him hope. He said it made him want to go back to his studio and paint. And as we kind of close this out a little bit, in what ways can we take some of these lessons from modern art, or some of these observations of modern art, and view how they give us hope?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe a couple things to say. So first of all, not all modern art is a picture of hope, right? So,
right.
It's more often a picture of despair. So we're not trying to gloss this today, or put a smiley face on it all, right? So that's not the purpose here. But our experience as a bunch of speakers, studio artists, art historians, and theologians was that as we looked into the lives and the work of many of these important artists, we did see light, and we did see gospel story, and we did see some evidence of transcendence and hope, right? So that was kind of our general kind of approach. We took these artists seriously. We treated them with respect, with regard, right? But I think one of the things that art draws us back to, and a point I'd want to make, while we still have some time, is that the first thing we learn about God in the scriptures is that God is a maker and a creator.
Yeah.
Before we learn anything else about God, that's the first thing we learn. And not only is he a maker and a creator, but he's one who delights in the things that he makes. He takes pleasure in them. It says 6 times that what he made was good, and then right at the end of Genesis 1 that it was very good. And then it goes on in the scriptures, the Psalms tell us, and Romans 1:20 tells us that when you look at the things that God made, that the Creator made, you see the evidence of his power and glory in the world. And then we're made in the image of God. So the Maker makes us to make.
We're co-creators.
It's one of the most fundamental things about us. And a point I'd like to add on top of that these days it seems to me that it's not our making so much that defines us, but our patterns of consumption. We're more consumers than makers. And this is one of Makoto Fujimura's major points in his writing, is the generativity of art, and how making culture, making things sits in contrast to, is a counter proposal to the consumer culture that we live in, where we are mainly identified by the brands that we wear, the products that we purchase, how we spend our money, the logos, on our shirts and our baseball caps, right?
Right. And let me just say,
is a counter proposal to that, yeah.
The book is God in the Modern Wing. We're just about out of time, and viewing art with the eyes of faith. Let me also mention that we have a link to upperhouse.org, and for those of you that might have somebody is going off to University of Wisconsin-Madison, you might want to go there as well. We're just simply out of time before we're out of content, but again, I want to thank you for joining us today. We've been talking about art, culture, and theology. I want to thank Andrew and Steve and Ivy, and we'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
At Point of View, we are already thinking about our New Year's resolution to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. But we can't accomplish that without your support. And right now, your support is especially critical, because whatever you give now through December 31st will be doubled up to $85,000. That means all gifts, whether $10 or $1,000, doubled through December 31st. Did you know Point of View is 100% listener supported? And it's more than just a radio show. Thanks to your support, we offer free tools to help Americans build a Christian worldview in their own lives and live it out in practical ways. Don't miss this opportunity to help more Americans build a Christian worldview in 2022. Give by December 31st to have twice the impact. To give today, visit pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Okay, this would be Tuesday, January 4th, in 3, 2, 1. Charles Cook tells a story about a friend who was taken on his 18th birthday and forced to take out $70,000 in student loans and then forced to go to college. At the end, he complained about having to pay back that student loan. He was, of course, kidding about the story that he used to explain how some